second installment Is Purim a serious holiday? Before we start to get into the spirit of Purim, we're going to ask Max, our resident musician, to play some joyful Purim melodies.
Who do you sing? Sing, please. Sing.
Sing.
Well, if I know the
We
words.
want you to sing.
Yom Purim, Yom... Okay.
Chag Purim, Purim, Masechos, do-do-do-do-do, Kamalarisha, Rosh, 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 Kamalarisha, Rosh, Rosh, Utzu Eitzav V'Sufa, Utzu Eitzav V'Sufa, Dabru Dabra V'la Yakum Ki Hanukkah, Utzu Eitzav V'Sufa, Dabra V'la Yakum Ki Hanukkah, Utzu Eitzav V'Sufa, Dabru Dabra V'la Yakum. Utzu Eitzav V'Sufa, Dabru Dabra V'la Yakum Ki Hanukkah, Utzu Eitzav V'Sufa, Dabru Dabra Yakum Ki Hanukkah. Last week we discussed the serious nature of Purim. Though it's the most joyous of holidays, it's also, in many respects, the most serious of holidays. Purim is when, in one sense, the miracle was a hidden miracle. It was couched in natural events. But the fact that a miracle happens within nature doesn't diminish its importance. In a certain sense, it magnifies its importance. It takes, only God could take something supernatural and put it into something natural. And that Purim is equated by the Zohar, which is the principal work of Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, with Yom Kippurim, with the Day of Atonement. Except that the Day of Atonement, you can only achieve the greatest spiritual heights through denying yourself physical pleasure, withdrawing from the physical world. Purim, you engage the physical world in even more than other holidays in order to access the higher spiritual consciousness. But nevertheless, in spite of the fact that Purim is so great and so holy and so special, Purim has one lack, one deficiency, that it wasn't a complete redemption. When the Jews were liberated from Haman, they still remained subjects of King Ahasuerus, who just moments before he hanged Haman, he was prepared to annihilate all the Jews. You know, when someone one day he says, you know what, I think we're going to not kill all the Jews, men, women, and children. And the next day he says, no, we're not going to do it. I don't trust a guy like that. Even when he says, I'm not going to do it, you can't put your trust in a person who could entertain the banality of evil, as they say, that it's no big deal. Oh, Haman, you want me to kill all the people? Keep the money, I'll do it, why not? Big deal. Anyone who thinks like that is very dangerous. So even after the miracle of Purim, we still had a king like Ahasuerus who was our monarch, and we had to follow his rules. So Purim did not end with a complete redemption, and that's why the Talmud says we don't recite the Psalms of Hallel, the Psalms of praise, which we recite on every other holiday, because the redemption was not complete. But nevertheless, it is a miracle, but it's a hidden miracle. It's a miracle that isn't so evident. That's more or less what we discussed last week. And to continue on that note, The end of the book of Esther, the Scroll of Esther, is about how Mordechai was promoted, and that Mordechai was held in very high esteem. But then it says something to cool off the enthusiasm about Mordechai. It says he was accepted by most of his brothers. Now, that's a little strange. You're trying to praise Mordechai, the hero of Purim, and you're saying, he was somewhat controversial. Not everyone accepted him. Mordechai is the hero of Purim. He's the prime minister of Persia. So who could have been opposed to Mordechai? And important enough that the book of Esther, the biblical book, should have to record this. And why end on a very negative note? Usually you want to praise your heroes. Parenthetically, the Jewish Bible, as they call it, is the only book written by a people that doesn't hold back from criticizing its greatest heroes and even exaggerating the criticism. There's no other text like that. You're not going to find cultures writing about their heroes and telling you their drawbacks, their faults. But here, Mordechai is not accepted by everyone. Who didn't accept him? So the Talmud, the oral tradition, fills us in with the details. Mordechai was a member of the Sanhedrin. He was one of the Jewish leaders. And he was really near the top of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a hierarchy. You had different levels. And when someone passed away, you moved up a level. Mordechai was very high up there. When he became prime minister of Persia, he was demoted. Why was he demoted? Because he was no longer able to devote himself to the study of Torah the way he did before. He was now involved in politics. He was a prime minister of the Persian Empire, and he had to deal with day-to-day needs for the community. So he was demoted. Some of his colleagues disassociated themselves from him. Now the majority supported him, but the minority did not support him. So the question is, why would the book of Esther end on that negative note? So I think the answer is based on the beginning of the book of Esther. The beginning of the book of Esther begins, and the end and the beginning are always connected. In Judaism, when you come to the end of something, you go right back to the beginning. It's like a cycle. You don't just end and then go on to the next book, which you do also, but in addition to going on to the next text, you go back to the beginning. What is the beginning? I think I mentioned this last week. It says, and it came to pass in the days of Achashverosh. The Talmud comments, whenever the Torah, the Bible, uses the term, and it came to pass in the days of, Vayehi Bimei, it indicates that what's going to follow will be a tragedy, a misfortune, a time of pain and anguish. What's the pain and anguish? So last week I said it's the fact that the people participated in the party that Achashverosh threw to commemorate the defeat of the Jews and the end of their dream of ever recovering their holy temple. And that was a terrible thing, that Jews should become members and participate in such a terrible celebration, celebrating your own defeat and the defeat of God in a certain sense, that God's promise would not materialize. But then there's a midrash that says that the word Achashverosh, the name of the king, is actually a hint to God himself, because Achashverosh has a few words lumped together, which if you spell it out, it would read, the one to whom the end and the beginning is his. Which existence is in the beginning of everything and the end of everything? God. So the Rabbi once asked, why is it considered a misfortune? It says, the opening words are, Vayehi Bimei, it came to pass in the days of, which indicates something that's going to follow as a misfortune. And the next word, at least according to this hint, is about God. God is not a misfortune. And the Rebbe says, yes, God is a misfortune when he's in a hint, when he's not fully revealed. When God has to hide, and you can only find hints to God's existence, that's the misfortune. And that's why the Megillah ends with a note about Mordechai, to tell us, do you know what happened Mordechai was a righteous person. The fact that he became prime minister was not something he could have turned down. When the king asks you to serve, you have to serve. If you want, you keep your head on your shoulders. So he had to do it, and not only did he have to do it because the king ordered him, this was his way of influencing the laws of the land in favor of the Jewish people. The Jews shouldn't be subjected to another Haman. So he was doing the right thing. But nevertheless, the fact that he had to even be involved in politics means that the Jews were still very much in exile. That's what the Megillah is trying to end. Yes, we ended on a good note. Mordechai is the hero. Jews were saved. Mordechai is the prime minister. Esther is the queen. But you know what? Mordechai lost some of his glory. He had no choice. He had to disassociate himself from his colleagues in the Sanhedrin because he was involved in protecting the Jewish people because we were still in exile. And so that's how the end of the Megillah, that's how the Megillah concludes, and that's how it begins. That we're living in an age when we're still in exile, so we celebrate the miracles on one hand, but we look forward to the next holiday, which is Pesach, which is a complete redemption, and we're asking God to give us the final redemption and not be content with just living securely in exile, because the truth is you can't live securely in exile. People would think we're living in the United States of America, a free country, and there's never been a country in the world in history that has been so good to Jews as the United States of America. And yet we're hearing politicians, including Jewish politicians, undermining the Jewish people's survival. That points to the idea that yes, as great as the exile could be, and we pray to God every day that our exile should be safe and secure, you can never be sure that you are safe and secure because we're still in exile. Let's talk about the obligations of Purim. Purim has many obligations and many customs. So we'll talk about the obligations and the customs. First of all, it's about the Megillah. The Megillah is the Scroll of Esther. The word Megillah means a scroll. And we're supposed to hear the reading of the Megillah on Purim twice, the night of Purim and the day of Purim. And although some obligations that apply to men do not always apply to women, the Talmud makes it very clear that women are obligated just as men to hear the Megillah, because they were also included in the miracle, because the women were also threatened with annihilation, not just the men. In addition to that, the heroine of Purim was a woman, Queen Esther, more so than Mordechai, because how do we refer to the book of Esther? The Scroll of Esther, Megillat Esther, not Mordechai. Mordechai isn't mentioned in the title, not even as a secondary author. It's only Esther. Why is Esther given that credit? First of all, she was the main heroine, but secondly, the story of Purim was a story that happened that could have been passed down orally from father to son, from one generation to the next. She asked the men of the great assembly, these are the prophets that the Jewish people had as their leaders, she said, please put this in writing for future generations. And there was a big debate about that. It wasn't so simple to add another book to the Bible. But she was the one who agitated for it, and she succeeded in getting them to write the story in the book of Esther. So if we have a Scroll of Esther, it's not because of Mordechai. Mordechai was not in favor of that necessarily. It was Esther who made sure that the book of Esther, the Scroll of Esther, I'm using both terms because it's referred to as a scroll as well as a book. It has elements of both. So we have to hear the Megillah twice, the night and the day of Purim, and you have to hear it in order. That means you can't hear, if you come late and you hear the second half, and then someone reads it and you hear the first half, you can't fulfill your obligation. You have to read it in order. Now, that's a statement in the Talmud. The Baal Shem Tov gave an interpretation to that. You can't read the Megillah backwards, which means you can't read the Megillah as past history. If someone says, you know what, I like reading the story of Purim because it's a nice story of what happened 2,000 plus years ago. No, it's happening today. You have to see the story of Purim as if it is going on, not just as if it is going on today. We are living in exile, we have miracles that we're surviving, and we also have threats to our existence. And how do we get rid of those threats? Well, how do they get rid of it in the book of Esther? The queen, what does she tell her? What does she tell Mordechai when Mordechai tells her to speak to the king? He says, I can't go. The king is not happy with me. I haven't been called to see the king in 30 days. And anyone who comes to the king in his inner chamber without permission is put to death. So my life is in danger if I go there because the king is not so happy with me. So what does Mordechai tell her? Go. And if you don't go, God will save us some other way and you will lose. You yourself will be lost. So Esther, when she hears that, she says, okay, gather all the Jews and fast 3 days and 3 nights, and I will also fast 3 days and 3 nights. Well, what is the fasting about? It's fasting and praying. Fasting in Judaism always goes together with prayers. You pray, but in order for your prayers to be stronger, you fast, and it's as if you're giving of yourself for God. And she said she's going to do that for 3 days. Now what's interesting, her great power was her beauty. That's why she was chosen as queen. Ask any woman how you look after 3 days and 3 nights of not eating or drinking. That's not exactly to make you look the most appealing. So it's obviously that she was banking on the fact that this was not a physical thing, that it's her spiritual status that is going to help save the Jews. So while she's going through the motion of going to the king and asking him to rescind the decree, she knew that it was in God's hands. So that's the only strength that we have as a people. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have tanks and planes and soldiers, because Judaism requires that we do things for self-defense. Not only are we allowed to, we're obligated to. But we know that our power lies in some higher authority, our connection to God. The word for the scroll of Esther is called Megillat Esther. The word Megillah means a scroll, but it also comes from a root that means revealing. It's revealing Esther is the hidden. When we read the book of Esther, we're revealing the hidden powers of God, that even when we're in exile, God is still in control. Now, it's customary when we come to the name Haman, we use our groggers, our noisemakers. We twirl you can make noise other ways also. Stamp with your feet, and any other way to blot out the name of Haman. But what is that based on? It's a custom, it's not an obligation, but what it's based on is that the Torah tells us that we're supposed to obliterate the memory of Amalek. Amalek was the evil nation that tried to attack the Jews. It did attack the Jews when they left Egypt, and subsequently they were always trying to attack Jews and annihilate them. And Haman was a descendant of Amalek, so we obliterate the memory of Amalek by making noise. But every Jewish custom has some deeper meaning. It's interesting, I don't remember who says this, but one of the commentators points out that there's a difference between Hanukkah and Purim. Both are holidays in which we celebrate miracles, but the difference is in Hanukkah, what do? We twirl the dreidel. By twirling it from the top of the dreidel, we spin it by its top. On Purim, we twirl the grogger, but the handle is on the bottom. What's the difference? The difference is that Hanukkah was an open miracle. God was running things from above. These were overt miracles. The oil that had enough to last for one night lasted for 8. The small untrained army of the Maccabees were able to defeat the Syrian Greek armies with hundreds of times more soldiers and equipment and training than the band of Maccabees. These were open miracles, so that's why we turn things from on top. as if to say all the miracles that we experience came from above. But in Purim, the miracles were concealed. You didn't see any open miracles, supernatural things happening. Everything was cloaked within nature, so the turning of the grager is the handle is underneath, as if to say we were the ones who caused the miracle to happen through our behavior. When the Jewish people, for that full year, between the time the decree was signed until it was supposed to be executed, the Jews could have converted and to save their lives, but not even one Jew considered giving up his religion or her religion. So we brought about the miracle, but it came from below. It was a hidden miracle. So that's one obligation of Purim, hearing the Megillah. And when you hear it, to internalize the message of the Megillah as well. The next obligation is Mishloach Manot, or the Yiddish version is Shlach Manos. What is that? We're supposed to send to at least one person 2 edible foods. Not raw food that you can't eat, but something that is ready to eat, an apple and a can of soda. I'm not vouching for its health benefits. You have to speak to the nutritionist about that. That's 2 kinds of foods, and they're ready to eat and ready to consume. What is the reason for this? It's written in the book of Esther that that's what the Jews decided, that they were going to celebrate Purim by exchanging gifts to a friend. 2 gifts to at least one friend. The more the merrier, of course. What is the logic behind that? So there were 2 opinions what the reason is, and they're both valid reasons. One opinion is given by Reb Shlomo Alkabetz, the author of the prayer L'Chadodi, a famous prayer that we recite Friday night. So he has an extensive commentary on the book of Esther, and he says there that one of Haman's arguments was that we are a fragmented people, that we're so divisive, we're so fragmented, we don't get along with one another. So in order to dispel that idea, to negate that idea, we exchange gifts to one another. Obviously, we couldn't be exchanging gifts to one another if we hate each other so much. That's one reason given. The second reason given is that on Purim we're supposed to have a feast, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but not everyone has food ready to eat. There are poor people who don't have the means, and even rich people are busy with their business. They didn't have time to prepare a meal. So you exchange gifts of food so everyone has what to eat on Purim. Those are the 2 reasons given for the sending of gifts. But then we come to the next mitzvah, is Matanos Levyonim, gifts to the poor. And that requires giving a minimal amount. It should, in other words, you can fulfill your obligation with a minimal amount to 2 poor people. Not just one, but to 2 different people. Maimonides writes, of all the mitzvahs of Purim, listening to the Megillah, exchanging gifts to your friends, hearing the reading of the Torah, which we'll talk about in this moment, reciting special prayers, the Feast of Purim, these are all important, but the most important mitzvah of Purim is to give gifts to the poor. This is the most important, and in order to fulfill this mitzvah, in this community, at least I do it, I collect from people and I distribute it to needy people. Some on Purim itself, preferably on Purim, but at least if I can't get it to them on Purim, I give it to them after Purim. So the more people give to this, is the better it is. Now, normally when you give tzedakah, when you give charity, you have a right to know who the recipient is going to be and make sure that he's not an imposter. You know, there are some people who will take your money and they don't need it. There are organizations that are fraudulent. So you have a right to investigate because you're giving your money. But in Purim it says, whoever stretches out his hand, you give. Don't ask questions. Purim is a time when you go beyond your limits. You don't ask questions. It reminds me of a story. I told this story many times. When I was a student, and I was far from a multi-billionaire, I wasn't even a hundredaire. There was a beggar, there were many beggars who would come around to the yeshiva, and I remember the students would give nickels. A nickel then was something, it was like $1 today, and we didn't even have that. So I used to give him a nickel. He used to come around regularly. Then I was sent by the Rabbi to Melbourne, Australia for 2 years, And a few months before I returned, I'm walking down the street with a friend, and I see a guy walking towards us, and I said, "He guy looks very familiar. Where did I see this guy?" And I said, "He looks like the beggar that used to collect our nickels." And sure enough, he comes over to me and he stretches out his hand. It was a day before Purim. So, because it was related to Purim, I gave him $1. I didn't ask any questions. You know, how could you afford to travel to Australia? In those days, traveling to Australia was about $1,800 round trip, and this is 55 years ago. So you're talking about a big sum of money. How could you afford? I didn't ask any question. I just gave him. A few months later, I'm back again in Brooklyn, in the yeshiva, and who do I see? I see the beggar. And I asked him, "Weren't you in Australia a few months ago?" And he admitted that he was. That was the same guy. So when it comes to Purim, you don't ask questions. Any other time you have of the year, you can ask questions when someone comes to you for charitable donations. You have a right to know that it's going to the right cause. The prophet Jeremiah, who was one of the great prophets, didn't have a lot of friends, and he got very upset at them and he cursed them. What was his curse? This is a Jewish curse, that when you give charity, you should give it to the wrong causes. That was a Jewish curse. That, you know, even when you do a mitzvah, you're not going to get credit for it because it won't go to the right recipients. When it comes to Purim, you don't care. You just give. And God, in kind, will respond that way. He'll just give us whether we were worthy or not. And as I said before, it's the most important mitzvah of Purim to bring joy to those unfortunate people. And the Maimonides adds to it, not just poor people, but widows and orphans, even if they're not poor, but by showing them that you care for them, bring more joy to people. That's the ultimate mitzvah of Purim. That's one of the reasons why the Rabbi instituted going to the prisoners and celebrating Purim with prisoners, because the Rabbi would explain, if you talk about poor people, there are different levels of poverty. In Hebrew, there are many words. I don't know if there's 7 words or 10 words for poverty, for poor. That shows that Jews were very much familiar with poverty. One of the words for a poor person is evyon. That's the word that's used in the Megillah. Well, what is an evyon? So Rashi explains, the word evyon means he wants everything because he has nothing. You could be a poor person financially, but you have a family, you have other things that give you some type of enrichment in your lives. But when you're an evyon, it means you have nothing. And the Rebbe explained that who could be put in that category, having nothing? A prisoner. Prisoner has nothing, because even if he has a family, he can't relate to his family because he's in prison and they're not, and sometimes they can't come to visit. You know, prisoners are the ultimate. They have no money. They can work for a full week. How much do they make? Roy? $5 for working 40 hours a week. They're poor in every respect of the word, and that's why it's important. So that's one of the reasons I go to Attica every Purim, or other prisons. Another mitzvah of Purim is the prayer of Al Hanisim. Al Hanisim is recited whenever we eat a meal with bread, and we say Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals. We add the special prayer, thanking God for the miracle of Purim. We do this on Hanukkah as well. We also, in our prayers, we add this additional prayer. Then there's the next mitzvah of Torah reading. We read the Torah. Before we read the Megillah in the morning, we read a section of the Torah, the story of Amalek attacking us when we left Egypt. It's a very short reading, 9 verses, but it's the going to the source of the whole story of Purim. The whole story of Purim started with a nation called Amalek that sought to destroy the Jewish people. And Haman was a descendant of Amalek. And you know why Haman was allowed to survive? How did Haman come about? When King Saul, the first Jewish king in Israel, was commanded by the prophet Shmuel, to wage war against Amalek and kill everybody. Not a very popular story to tell people, but if you knew that if he had followed that commandment, there would not have been a Holocaust maybe we'd think differently about these things. But anyhow, he was commanded to wipe out everyone, but he spared the king, Agag. He felt, you know what, why should I kill the king? It's good to have the king as a prisoner. It's good for the glory of our victory, whatever. He had good intentions. And before Agag was killed by the prophet, he was able to father a child. And that child became the ancestor of Haman. And who knows if Hitler was not also a descendant of that original Agag. So we read that story of Amalek every Purim in the morning. Another mitzvah is to have a feast. But before I talk about the feast, the negative one is you're not allowed to fast on Purim. So if you're on a crash diet and you want to fast, don't do it on Purim. Postpone it for the next day or the day after. The next day is also you shouldn't fast because it's Shushan Purim. You can't eulogize. If God forbid there's a funeral on Purim, you can't postpone a funeral because it's Purim. And the rabbi usually gives a eulogy and family members give eulogies. You have to be discreet about the eulogy. You can't focus on the sadness of the day. So what you do is you say with more brief remarks, and the focus should not be on how terrible this tragedy is that this person passed away, but focus on the positive. But let's get to the feast itself. The feast itself is unique, that it has to be a feast with wine in it. And it has to be a feast with meat, if you're not a vegetarian. And it's a real festive holiday feast. And everyone is invited to my house on Purim Day at 6:30. There are a lot of parties going on in Purim, and usually people come to my house after there are other parties. And some of them are a little tipsy. Now, on Hanukkah, there is no mitzvah to have a feast. And the question is asked, why is Purim different from Hanukkah? Purim, we have a feast, and Hanukkah, you could have, but you don't have to. And the answer is that Hanukkah was mainly a spiritual struggle. The Syrian Greeks did not want to annihilate the Jews. They wanted to impose Greek culture on Israel, and the Jews were resisting. A minority of Jews resisted. So they fought the Jews, and they killed Jews, but that was not their objective. Their objective was to impose Greek culture. It was a spiritual, ideological battle between the Jews and the Greeks. So how do we celebrate spiritual victories? Not so much with the physical engagement with food, but more with light. Light is a physical substance, light, but it's the most subtle and spiritual of physical things. So we focus on the light. Light is a metaphor for spirituality. Light is a metaphor for God. Light is a metaphor for knowledge. We say enlightenment. But Purim, the objective was not to wipe out Judaism per se. That was not Haman's objective. He hated Jews, and he wanted all Jews, men, women, and children, annihilated, their physical body. So it's mostly a physical struggle. And that's why, how do you celebrate the victory of a physical struggle? By feasting, by eating food, because we're physical beings, and celebrating that with physical food and drink. The Talmud says that we're supposed to drink so much on Purim until we no longer know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. And that's problematic because Judaism is not for intoxication. We don't celebrate intoxication. But yet Purim seems to be an exception to the rule. And there's a big dispute going on for centuries. Does it mean literally we're supposed to become so wasted that we no longer know the difference between Haman and Mordechai? Or does it mean something deeper? So I have a book that I wrote that has collected 70 explanations what it means. And that's only a small sampling. There's much more than 70. It seems that rabbis like to find new meanings every time, every Purim. But the most plausible explanation, Maimonides says that you drink more than usual till you get tired and you fall asleep. When you're sleeping, you don't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. So Maimonides takes an in-between view. It means literally that you no longer know the difference, but not because you became totally wasted, but because you drank more than usual, because it's such a joyous time, and you fall asleep, and when you're sleeping, you don't know the difference. But the Rabbi once gave this explanation, and he said that normally we reject Haman. That's what cursed as Haman means. We reject evil, and we embrace goodness. That's what it means when we say, blessed is Mordechai. What do we base our rejection of evil and our embracing of goodness? What do we base it on? We base it on das, on our knowledge. Someone will ask you, what's wrong with Hamas? You say, what's wrong is they're a bunch of bloodthirsty murderers. You're aware of how evil they are, and what's so good about, and you could pick on a million different people. They're good people, they're honest people, they're decent people, they're moral people. You base it on your understanding. Purim, you have to reach a level that even when you lose your understanding, you can't rationally explain what's wrong with Hamas. You can't rationally explain what's good about so many Jewish people, so many holy people. You can't rationally explain it. You still, in your gut, you recognize that Haman is cursed and Mordechai is blessed. That means you should drink to the point where you no longer know the difference. It's in your gut. It's natural. It's something. It's automatic. You don't have to think about it. It's innate. It's part of your whole being. Because Purim is a day when you reach a level of consciousness that transcends your knowledge. Because human knowledge is finite, but our consciousness is infinite. The consciousness comes from the godly entity, the godly energy within us, and that transcends human knowledge. So that's what Purim is. It's a time when even when we lose our knowledge, we still embrace Mordechai and reject Haman. That's one of 70 explanations. Now, on Purim, we have customs. One of them is the children go masquerading, and adults who act as children, which is fine on Purim. We go masquerading, we wear masks. Why do we wear masks on Purim? So there are several explanations. One is that the miracle was a hidden miracle. So by masking ourselves, that symbolizes how what happened on Purim was based on a hidden miracle, covered up. Another explanation is, the Talmud asks, why do the Jewish people deserve such a threat to their very existence? What did they do wrong? And the Talmud says what they did wrong is they bowed down to an idol when they were told by the king that if they don't bow down to the idol, they'll be killed. So they didn't really mean it. They just acted as if they would worship an idol. So God also acted as if he wanted the Jews destroyed, because in the end the Jews did not get destroyed, but the threat was there. So the whole story of Purim revolves around that what happened overtly, externally, covered up what was really going on. We worshiped the idol, but deep down we didn't mean it. God threatened our existence, but deep down he didn't mean it. So how do we represent that idea that it's only on the surface, not beneath the surface, by wearing masks? Then we eat Hamantaschen, and some people kreplach. And the scientific theory behind this is that the kreplach, after millions of years of evolution, came on dry land, and they became Hamantaschen. That's, you heard it, this confirmed biology. So if anyone asks you, do I believe in evolution? Yes. Kreplach evolved into Hamantaschen. It's the same idea. There's a filling, and it's covered up with dough. That's not my idea. I got it from a rabbi in Albany, Rabbi Reuben. It says if you quote your sources, you bring redemption to the world, and it's based on Purim. In what way is it based on Purim? How did Mordechai become such a special person in the eyes of the king? Because when Mordechai detected there was a plot against the king, he told Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordechai. Had she not mentioned Mordechai, Mordechai would have been a nobody to the king. So the whole miracle of Purim was caused by quoting your sources. So while I was telling this thing about the evolutionary theory, I was thinking to myself, it's not my idea. And Purim, of all times, I shouldn't hide the source. So that's the Rabbi Yisrael Rubin in Albany. Now, Hamantaschen is a very interesting topic. You wouldn't believe this, a lot to say about Hamantaschen. Where did the name come from, Hamantaschen? So literally, Hamantaschen means Haman's, in Israel they call it Oznei Haman, Haman's ears. And the legend is that before they hanged Haman, they cut off his ears. So we eat Hamantaschen. There's no basis to that anyone ever would cut off anyone's ears before hanging them. But there's a comedy skit that was written in the 16th century in Italy, which referred to Haman's ears being cut off. And but it's interesting that the word ears is used for other pastries in Jewish sources, and even in European sources they refer to pastries as ears. So it has nothing to do with Haman's ears. It's just another way of referring to eating pastries on Purim. But the most plausible theory about Hamantaschen is that it's not Hamantaschen. It's Muntaschen. Mun is poppy seeds. In the olden days, when I was a kid, the only kind of Hamantaschen there was poppy seed Hamantaschen, and that evolved into prune Hamantaschen, and then everything else broke loose, and you could have any type of jelly or any type of sweet thing inside the dough. But why is it called Muntaschen? Because originally they used poppy seeds. Why would they use poppy seeds? Because there's a custom that in Purim you eat seeds. It's not a very well-known custom. What's the reason for that? So one reason given is in the Bible. It's the story of Daniel, who was an advisor to the king, the Babylonian king, and because he kept kosher, he would only eat seeds. But what does Daniel have to do with Purim? The answer is when Esther communicates with Mordechai, she communicates through a guy, one of his servants called Hatach, who our sages identify as Daniel. That Daniel became Esther's servant. But it goes beyond that. How did Queen Esther, whose identity as a Jew she didn't reveal, she couldn't eat the food in the palace, so she would eat seeds. So we commemorate that by eating pastries with seeds in it. That's and the Hebrew word, the Yiddish word is not Hamantaschen, but mun. And tashin are pockets of poppy seeds. That's the most plausible theory, is where that name came from. Now, some say that when Mordechai had to send messages to the Jewish people to tell them about the impending disaster, he couldn't tell them openly because it was a secret. So what he did, he sent messages, but to hide the messages, they hid it in pastries. So that's another reason given why we eat pastries on Purim. Also, the miracle was a hidden miracle. That's why we eat the dough that conceals the content. Although now they make Hamantaschen where you could see the jelly. Maybe now we're closer to Mashiach, so we see the miracles more openly. But in those days, when the miracles were hidden, they're covered up with dough, and you have to bite into it to see what is really the main ingredient. There's another legend that Haman wore a three-cornered hat. That's why we have Hamantaschen are triangular, because Haman's hat was three-cornered. Now, how does anyone know? There are no pictures of Haman that we know of. So where does that come from? So some say that what saved the Jewish people was the fact that the Jewish people are based on three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And to indicate that the merits of the patriarchs saved us, we eat pastries that are triangular. Also, another reason why that we eat triangular, because the Hebrew word keren, which means corner, also means pride. Horns, when Moses had horns because the rays of light came out of his head, that the root of that word means something that is a source of great pride and good fortune. And in the book of Psalms, we talk about how the Keren of the wicked I'll cut down, that refers to Haman. The pride of Haman and the pride of Mordechai was exalted. So that's why we have triangular Hamantaschen, because the word corner in Hebrew also means the pride. The pride of Mordechai was promoted, and the pride of Haman was demoted. And the word Hamantaschen, the word tash in Hebrew means weakening, that Haman's power was weakened. That's another hint. There's another theory I read by a 20th century rabbi. I forgot his last name, so I can't mention it. So he writes the following, that in Jewish law, you're not allowed to plant in Israel two different species together. But if they're separated, then it's all right. You can have two different species. But one way of separating is if one species has a triangular form that enters in between another species. Because it's triangular, it's very clearly demarcated that you know that this is one species, that's another one. There's no mixture. In other words, when you have something triangular that inserts itself into something else, you can still determine the differences. And that the Jewish people, one of the things that Haman said about the Jewish people is that we are a nation that doesn't mix with all other nations. We keep to ourselves. And the Jewish people, no matter how hard they try to assimilate, it was on the, it wasn't supposed to ring. As hard as we try to assimilate, we're never going to be capable of assimilating. We won't be accepted by the world, and if we do anything else but being who we are. We are separate from everyone else, for good and for bad. They don't like us because we're separate, and then we survive because we are separate. So these are different theories about Hamantaschen and Kreplach. Now, Purim is not over with Purim. The next day after Purim is Shushan Purim. And Shushan Purim is observed, if you live in Shushan. Anyone here live in Shushan? No, but there are other places in the world where you keep Shushan Purim. Where is that? In Israel, in Jerusalem. Why do you keep Shushan Purim in Jerusalem? Because in the book of Esther it says, all cities that have walls around them from the days of Joshua, that means when Jews can't enter into Israel for the first time, and there are cities that had walls around them, those are the cities that read the Megillah, that celebrate Purim the next day. If your cities that didn't have walls around them, they read it on Purim. Others read it on Shushan Purim. Although there's no more Shushan, Shushan Purim is kept in those cities in Israel that did have walls. Jerusalem, we know, had walls. Jericho, we know, had walls. There are other cities we're not so sure about, so they read it on both days, because it's a question whether they had walls or not, like Tiberias and other cities in Israel. So why was it determined? I mean, Shushan is Shushan. It's a city in Persia, in Iran. Why does it apply to the cities in Israel? And the Talmud says because the miracle of Purim happened in the diaspora, happened in exile. Israel did not play a prominent role in the whole story of Purim. It played a role behind the scenes. What was the role? That King Ahasuerus was afraid that the temple will be rebuilt, and he did everything in his power to stop that, and he succeeded. And that's why he was afraid that when Esther wanted to speak to him privately in a party, that she was an agent of the Jews to get him to rescind his order to stop building the Beis HaMikdash. But that's all behind the scenes. Openly, Israel doesn't feature prominently in the whole story and miracle of Purim. So in order to get Israel into the whole picture, the law is that if you lived in cities that had walls around them in Israel, you would read the Megillah on a separate day. That way, Purim is associated with Israel. That shows us the centrality of Israel in Judaism. Even the miracles that had nothing to do with Israel, we still connect it and link it to Israel. Okay, any questions?
Can you explain why we celebrate Shushan Purim?
Okay, the reason why we celebrate Shushan Purim is because what happened, most people are not familiar with the events. The events really started on Pesach, or a few days before Pesach, on the 13th day of the month of Nisan. That's 2 days before Passover. That's when the decree to annihilate all the Jews was issued. And the date that was decided would be the 13th of Adar, 11 months later. Queen Esther then comes to the king and pleads with him, and he says, I can't rescind any decrees. That's against the laws, as if they observed all the laws. But that law I can't rescind. But I could give you a second decree that gives the Jews the right to defend themselves. Jews had to have permission to defend themselves. We're seeing the same thing. Ahasuerus of America is giving the Jews, well, you can defend yourselves up to the certain point. You can't go beyond that point.
Yes, we're still at that point now.
Right.
We still can't defend ourselves.
Right. So we have, yes?
What about the giving of the half shekel? That's not a mitzvah?
Yeah, it is. That's before Purim. Okay, I'm glad you raised that. I'll mention it later. So the Jews were given permission to defend themselves, and indeed they did. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, there was a war, and the Jews killed 75,000 terrorists. In other words, people who were out to kill Jews. It was self-defense. And just to show how important it was that it was a matter of self-defense, the Megillah emphasizes over and over again, they did not take a single penny from their victims. There was no spoils. This is unprecedented. In every war, in every culture, there are spoils of war. You conquer and you inherit their wealth. Here the Jews touched nothing. They just defended themselves. But the main enemies were still in the city of Shushan. So Queen Esther says to the king, could you do me a favor? He asks her, what else could I do for you? Could you let the Jews in Shushan continue fighting the next day? And he said yes. And they killed another 500 terrorists, Amalekites, in the city of Shushan. So Shushan experienced, when did they rest? They fought on the 14th. Everyone else fought on the 13th and rested on the 14th. The people of Shushan fought on the 13th and 14th, and they rested on the 15th of the month. So that's why they observe Purim on the 15th, while we do on the 14th. Yes?
So, long ago, I had always told that one of the other secrets that in Purim is that Esther and Mordechai are not their actual Jewish names, that we never really know.
Well, Esther was Hadassah. The Megillah says that.
Esther is really Ishtar, and Mordechai means Mordechai, and that they're really Persian names, and that we don't really know their true Jewish names.
Well, Esther we do know, because it says in the Megillah her name was Hadassah.
Hadassah.
Right. If Mordechai had another name, I'm not familiar if we know what other name he might have had.
So those were their Persian names, Esther and Mordechai.
Yeah, I believe so. That they were Persian. They sound Persian. Yeah?
This is when you talk about Hamantaschen, is song, my head has 3 corners. 3 corners has my head. 3 corners So it's Hamantaschen?
Is that you can't fulfill your obligation with